welcome back. Welcome to our first afternoon session in stream 1 from 1:30 to 3:30, or to 3 o'clock rather, Eastern time. It's great to have everybody back with us, and also to have our first speaker back with us again. Once again this year. It's always great to see you. Imogen Casebourne is here with us, and she is currently with the University of Oxford in the UK. And she's going to talk about online learning and how online learning always happens somewhere. Where and when will office workers learn post-pandemic? So a little look ahead to the future that I'm excited to hear about. So I'm going to turn it over to Imogen and let you take it away.
Thank you, David. I'm just going to share my screen now, hopefully. So I've worked as an instructional designer for over 20 years, and I've been mostly focused on designing blended courses, games-based learning, mobile learning, and even a mobile authoring tool, but all focused on helping people to learn for work. And as David said recently, I've been studying for a PhD at the University of Oxford. And in doing that, I wanted to take a little bit of a step back from designing and creating and have a look in a bit more depth at how people were engaging with learning technology. So in today's talk, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of my findings from my research, which I think are relevant to this topic. And I'm also going to share some surveys and studies on what actually happened during the pandemic and some thoughts about what that might mean for the future. So to get started, so right back in March 2020, when countries like the UK and the US started to lock down, the Learning Guild did a snapshot survey, and what they found, probably not surprisingly, was that there was an immediate wholesale switch from face-to-face instructor-led training to virtual instructor-led training, and similarly from face-to-face meetings to virtual meetings. So probably no surprise there. And I've also included this data point, though, from their research. I've represented it as a bar chart because I thought these particular pieces were really interesting. You have 2019 and 2020 there. And as you can see, respondents who were saying that most training in 2019, over 50% of people said most training was in-person instructor-led training, and only 4% were saying that most training was virtual instructor-led training. And you can see that's completely swapped around in 2020. Only 3% of respondents saying that most training was face-to-face, and nearly 50% saying that most training was now virtual instructor-led training. So a big switch there. No surprises perhaps to virtual methods, and they reported that some of the virtual instructor-led training was seven hours in length, which could potentially lead to Zoom fatigue if if there weren't enough breaks. Similarly, the FOSWay group, UK group, reported a 5-fold increase in the use of virtual classrooms for high development programs. So again, a big shift to virtual instructor-led training being reported. And LinkedIn did a survey in 2020 where they asked people to look to the future. And as you can see here, 74% of people said they expected to spend less on instructor-led training in the future, and 79% said they expected to spend more on online learning. So there was an anticipation that things wouldn't simply switch back to how they were before the pandemic. And respondents also said that they envisaged a more hybrid way of working in the future, as well as changes to work-related learning. So I just want now to briefly talk about my research into mobile learning, which I think is relevant to the experiences that people have had during the pandemic. So I was looking at the concept of seamless learning, and I've included a definition here, but the idea being that an individual with a mobile device and using learning technology might be able to have an integrated learning experience, even though the learning activities themselves might take place in a variety of settings. So, for example, they might start off learning at work, they might be learning on transportation. A lot of people in London, so they're often on the train on the way to and from work, and they were learning there, and they might be learning at home. So it's the idea of an integrated, holistic approach to learning, which could take place in many locations. I just wanted to include this quote here, which is about the pandemic, but was also very relevant to my research. It's often quite easy to sort of think of the more abstract online learning as somehow almost immaterial. It could take place anywhere, but it always actually happens somewhere. And I became quite interested in the relation of people's settings to what they were learning. And there seemed to be a distinction. These icons here represent people whose settings were very relevant to their work and to their learning. So if you're working in a laboratory or a kitchen, or if you're a plumber, or that strange person down the bottom is meant to be representing someone responding to an environmental emergency out in the countryside, all of these people, learning about their work is quite closely tied to where they're working. And they're the sort of people who didn't work from home during the pandemic. They were still going into work, or they weren't working at all. And for people like this, learning technology can be hugely helpful. It allows you to reach out to experts who aren't with you in your location. You can look things up just-in-time resources, or take images and videos of practice to share with people later. So all very useful. And it's also possible to abstract from the current elements of practice from a setting, so it can be practiced elsewhere. So this is the Domino's pizza game, and the rumor is that if you're really good at playing this pizza game, Domino's get in touch and offer you a job. I'm not sure if that's really true, but I've also seen other cooking games which again aim to train would-be professional chefs in how to get things ready, how to put things on the grill at the right time, to have everything cooked to perfection. And that sort of timing and order is something you can actually practice away from the kitchen. So some of what they need to learn can be abstracted. But a lot of my respondents and the people I was talking to in the study, their work and their learning looked more like these people, these icons here. It was very abstract, and in theory, it could have taken place anytime, anywhere. What they were doing didn't seem especially related to where they were doing it. And that raised questions for me, as to why they were moving around, and also what their experience was of working and learning where they were essentially ignoring their surroundings rather than paying close attention to their surroundings, as with the previous group. And so I started thinking about institutions. And what I mean by that is thinking about people moving between work and home as they were doing their work-related learning. In both of those places, there are values, traditions as to who does what. The individual has a role. There are things they're expected to do, whether that's housework or other work, depending on where they are. So there are things related to the learner's setting which can impact how easy it is for them to engage in online learning. And just showing some quotes here that illustrate some of the difficulties that some people reported with online learning at work. So this person is saying, well, it's actually very difficult to concentrate doing e-learning at my desk. It's very noisy. It's really not easy, and so I prefer to move somewhere else. And this person is saying, well, it's easy to plan, but then it's not the most urgent thing, and if something urgent comes up, I'll probably do that instead. And then when these people got home, again, they were interrupted. They were in homes where they had flatmates if they were young, or family members, and again, it was difficult for them to concentrate. And people with young children often waited till late in the evening after the children had gone to bed. But of course, by that time they might be tired and probably not giving it their best. So the sort of dream and indeed the experience for some people of being fascinated by a work-related topic and learning about it at work, continuing to learn about it as they travelled home, and then carrying on at home. That certainly was the experience of some people, but for other people, there were issues. So on the left at work, they were saying it was too noisy, there were too many interruptions, or they felt guilty actually engaging in e-learning because they felt they ought to be working instead. And then when they got home, there were household chores, they might have childcare, but some of them did actually multitask, and they might listen to podcasts or try and fit in some bursts of e-learning in between doing lots of other things. But again, it wasn't completely straightforward for some of the people I spoke to. And then, of course, in the pandemic, those sort of separations and distinctions of place between the workplace and home fell away. And suddenly many people were working from home. And I think that intensified some of the issues that they've been telling me about before the pandemic. And so what were the experiences of working and learning at home during the pandemic? Again, I've included a quote from Selwyn and Jandrik that I thought was quite interesting. As they say, if you have a nice big house with a study, it's probably going to be easier than if you're in a small apartment and there isn't anywhere you can go and concentrate. And if you're not trying to homeschool your children, it's going to be easier for you to be working and learning. And I think a lot of people became very aware of those distinctions and challenges over the last year. And again, this is some research from the Emerald Group, who do sort of longitudinal study every year. And you can see here that people who were saying it was essential, very useful to be able to access online learning, courses, resources, etc. on a mobile device rose during COVID compared to other years. And we can hypothesize that perhaps they were trying to escape to places where they'd be less interrupted within their homes, perhaps. And someone did a study looking at the experience of working from home during the pandemic. And again, unsurprisingly, people with young children at home obviously found that they were balancing that with additional childcare, and the experiences of people in terms of how much childcare they did varied quite considerably, as you can see here. But it wasn't all bad. I just wanted to include these two tweets because they illustrate quite an important point, that things actually got better for some people. So this person here is saying that one of the bright spots of the pandemic was a chance to go to conferences and do panels, etc., that they'd have had to turn down because they didn't need to travel, they didn't need to find childcare. It wasn't necessary for them to take several hours to do something, and many things became more possible. And I also interviewed someone who suffered from a chronic health condition, and they said they found online and virtual learning much more inclusive and accessible because they didn't, again, have to travel, and they could rest in breaks, and it just made it much easier for them. So there have certainly also been some positives for some people in the widespread shift to virtual that we've recently seen. So what does that mean for the future as companies start to think about hybrid methods? Some organisations are hoping to go back to the office, back to how things were. Others are thinking of staying completely online, but many are thinking about hybrid. So I wanted to just summarise some of the pros and cons of the various approaches, and going back to how people used to learn for work before there was so much classroom training. It was often very much on the job through an apprenticeship model. And the advantages of learning in your workplace about your work is that it's a very rich environment. The cues that you get in terms of how you store memories and how you retrieve them, it's the sound, it's the way things smell, it's what you see, it's what you hear. And so that idea of grounded cognition means that you're triggered to remember to do certain things just by the environment that you're in and the setting that you're in. So that was a very rich way to learn. But obviously, there are also some downsides. For one thing, you can't necessarily learn everything you need to know, because some events are rare and some things are abstract, which is what led to synchronous, I think, instructor-led learning, because there you can learn about rare events and abstract concepts. And I think a really important thing that's sometimes overlooked is that it involves a place where you won't be interrupted. And by convention, you're not expected to do anything else. So there will be no small children. You don't have access, hopefully, to your email. You're not expected to do other tasks. So you're simply expected to concentrate on learning, and it's a sacred place for learning. And there are other advantages. Again, being face-to-face, instructors can read visual cues, participants' body language. They get more, perhaps richer feedback, and people can network and meet in breaks. It feels easier and more informal, perhaps, to ask questions. But even there, for face-to-face learning, there is a downside. The numbers are limited by the physical size of the location. It's inflexible. You need to plan in advance. It can be expensive. And as I said, it can be tiring for people with chronic health conditions, and hard for people who might need to make childcare arrangements. On the other hand, the switch to virtual suddenly means access is much broader. It's quicker to arrange. It can happen when needed, and it can be more inclusive, as I've just said. But there were some downsides. Again, it's for many people, there is no quiet place to concentrate, and obviously it's reliant on the technology, and it's not clear who was providing that in every case, whether that's the individual or the organisation. And then I've included a couple of papers here on Zoom fatigue, which I think has been an issue for some people. Apparently, it's partly related to the need to perform enthusiasm and friendliness in a way that you might not have to do in a face-to-face section to the same extent, and also monitoring yourself on screen, which we're not used to doing, to have to watch yourself all the time. And there was an interesting study I've also included about the effect of bandwidth issues. Apparently, in this study, the authors found that people who sounded slower because they had bandwidth problems were interpreted as being mentally slower by the people they were working with, which is obviously a considerable disadvantage. So there are some problems and downsides for virtual instructor-led training. And in synchronous online learning, so the e-learning, online resources, again, it's flexible and it can be more inclusive because you can do it anywhere. But for that also, as I was finding in my research, there are downsides, particularly the fact that it can be constantly postponed. It never seems to be the most urgent thing, is that it's very easy that people actually never get to it. And if they do, they're often doing it late at night when they're probably quite tired and they've done a lot already that day, and that might not be the optimal time to learn. So with that in mind, summarising some of those pros and cons, I think for hybrid models, it's going to be important to combine the best of each approach, and ideally try to avoid a lack of inclusivity. And I think a hybrid model that combines some physical elements and some virtual elements won't necessarily achieve that, because it would be possible to have a situation where some people find the face-to-face classroom elements inaccessible, and other people find the virtual elements inaccessible if some thought and planning isn't given to who's coming and how they'll be accessing. So I did a sort of big, I sort of tried to bring everything together into a single table there. And I've highlighted in bold some of the important, I think the importance of having a place to concentrate on online learning, even if that place isn't a place where you come together with other people, and some of the issues with virtual technology, and I've put together some suggestions in terms of what we can do to make hybrid work, and I think providing more places and apologies for the helicopter. That is the search and rescue helicopter that goes over my house sometimes. And there is I think if we can look to integrate physical options with online options, that could really help bring us the best of both worlds. And considering physical virtual breakout rooms, a combination of the two. And perhaps offering locations for quiet study in the office for people who don't have the opportunity to easily study quietly at home. And finally, scheduling times for learning so that people know that it really is the most important thing, and to try and help them not constantly postpone it until late at night, which some people were doing. So that's just just to summarize. I think if you're looking to develop a hybrid model, I would suggest conducting a technical audit, seeing what people's kits are looking like. I don't know how many people track the times that online learning is being accessed, but that can certainly give you some insights potentially into what people are doing, when they're accessing, and for how long. Obviously ask people what they want. And I mentioned a moment ago, I think looking for solutions that offer the options for physical and online participation so that people can choose either or could be the most inclusive. And again, perhaps offering quiet places for learning in the office. So I think that brings me to the end of the presentation. But I wanted to actually, before we see if there are any questions for me, to ask some questions of you, the participants. And I was going to suggest perhaps if you might be interested in sharing the answers in chat, we can perhaps reproduce some of the networking that we might have over coffee if we were meeting up together physically. And I'd be really interested to know your answers to some of these. Oops, sorry. Do you have quiet places? Do you have libraries or reading rooms or somewhere you can sit and study that's away from your desk? Are those sorts of arrangements in existence? Are there dedicated times of day or days set aside for learning in your organization? And does your organization sort of track times of day or try and set times for learning? So that's the presentation. I'm going to stop sharing now, and let's see if we can find some discussion points in the chat.
Great. Well, thanks so much. And yeah, there's time for a few questions, questions in the chat or the Q&A. And while people are getting some of their questions together, so I had one that's maybe a little different to see if you'd had a chance to maybe. This is something you'd run across and thought about a little bit. One of the things that, as I've thought we lost the most in sort of remote working, and I've worked remotely for a long time anyway, is the informal learning more than as much as the formal learning. So I wonder if you ran across anything that might help facilitate that in sort of this hybrid world, especially, my own experience is people that I've worked with for a while before, it's pretty easy. We have our ways, it's fine. People, when you're working with, new groups of people, sometimes it's really easy, sometimes it's more difficult to establish the right channels.
Yeah, I know exactly what you mean. And I think it can be challenging. I've heard people trying online coffee, but if you're on Zoom all day in meetings, I right. think for some of those people, online coffee wasn't quite that attractive. And I know at the university they have online study groups, and I found this absolutely fascinating because a friend of mine does this, and they used to all get together in a place so that they did their writing, and I think the idea was you would do your writing because everyone around you was writing too. But now they log into Zoom and they all silently write together on Zoom, which I found quite fascinating.
Yeah, I'm kind of with you on that. I actually have two nieces who are in their early teens, and they did a lot of that during the really deep pandemic times with their friends, just they would kind of, couldn't go see your friends, so they'd all just get on Zoom and just kind of, live their lives. And it's a really, it's odd enough hard for me to picture just by being a technology person. That seems like too much screen time even for me. I don't know.
Yeah, I agree. And to your other point about ice breaking with people who don't know, I think I don't know, maybe games or quizzes or something where you get people together in an informal way before you start the meeting. I think it needs to be more orchestrated, perhaps, to try and, break the ice and get people to have those more informal conversations that somehow help.
Yeah, no, it's a tricky question. How to get people to form relationships in that, in that kind of situation, and maybe even moving forward as it's more hybrid. If you don't have, are there people that you work with that will be in the office on the days when you're not in the office? If people are starting to come in sort of periodically for some time, and do you ever get to know each other, or how does that work? And are there things that we would want to do, and we'd want to maybe recommend the organizations do to try to facilitate that, or maybe different technology? I don't know. I don't know what I mean by that either, right? There are certain ways in which people sometimes connect on Twitter. They connect on a, some kind of discussion forum somewhere, or they don't. And so there's, it's, how do you bring that about and put people in the right situations where, people with different personalities and interests would sort of find themselves comfortable, and there's a lot to think about.
Yeah.
Good. All right. Anything else from our audience? Other questions and other comments on us? Because really, it's an interesting, time coming up as we see, going back from, because it's not exactly going back, right? It's not, we're going to, even as we start, at least here in New York, we're starting to get closer. People are going to the office a little bit. You're starting to see more, universities are planning on opening up in the fall by and large in person, but not everything is going back. Some things are moving forward to a different world that's, a mix of so it's a hybrid mix of things. And everybody's also had this experience over the past year. And have you also felt, if you ran across this, did you see things that indicated there's some additional resistance to quote unquote online learning? Meaning, in other words, people often associate online learning with Zoom, these days with virtual learning, right? With live virtual learning. And so that's not the only kind of online learning there is, as we all, of course, know with this conference, but not, they don't necessarily know that, for example, at the New York Times, there's a headline just the other day about how, there's so much resistance to online learning. There's resistance to that online learning, but is there sort of a way to get the message across that there's so much more and that there's so many different experiences that can help people get more comfortable as they move into the new world? Because I like to think that everybody knows what we know, but they really don't.
No, I think you're right. For me, before we suddenly had to be learning virtually, I always used to think that learning technology should be doing something better, or something that couldn't be done, or rather than just sort of reproducing a classroom experience. And so I think, for me, that's what online learning should ideally be doing. We're at Learning Technologies Group. It's a global organization, and we did quite often have training sessions where people were dialing in and people were in the office. And so we did manage to have that sort of hybrid virtual physical training session, which was a workshop. And I think that can work for people who are in the office on different days. We just need to think about ways of doing that better, I think, as we go forward.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I know you and I have long been aligned in that philosophy, and it does seem like there's still maybe an opportunity to do some more things. Well, thanks. So I guess I've unfortunately taken up our time, but it's great to talk with you as always, and great to have you at the conference and in this role and as a chair and everything else. So thanks once again, Imogen.